Whoa, Amos is pretty ticked off right there.
He is uber angry.
Well, what I love, of course, about Amos is he's angry about the poor are not being treated well. And so it's coming from a place of compassion and justice. But I tell you, it's all about judgment too, because God's going to nail them because they're screwing up. And it's like, what do you do?
Yeah, I'm glad that he kind of lands on familiar words to many of us, right? Words of kind of inspiration. Because honestly, if not, we probably wouldn't be talking about it right now.
Yeah, so let's talk about it right now. The Hebrew prophets are this amazing category in our Bible. Amazing figures. The Hebrew prophets were this mix of mystics and poets and performance artists and social justice warriors, somehow all combined together. In fact, I find that combination deeply inspiring. Just take the mystic and social justice warrior. It seems like in our world, or certainly churches, we separate those off. You have some churches that are very contemplative and prayerful and talking about the experience of God all the time and spirituality. Then you have other churches that almost never talk about God and are all social justice energized, which is awesome. But somehow the Hebrew prophets combine that. I mean, these prophets had direct mystical experiences of God. Isaiah in the temple, when the vision sort of shimmers him into another world, or Ezekiel by the river in Babylon, or Jeremiah in the almond orchard when God touches his mouth and even knew him while he was in the womb. These mystical direct experiences, and then they're propelled or to become the divine mouthpiece, to speak for God, for justice. I wish more of our churches could combine experience God and be propelled to seek a better world. That combination is awesome, but I worry about something. The Hebrew prophets are so cool, but there's no category for that in our modern world that I know of. I mean, the Hebrew prophet in the ancient world was a specific category. There was a king, and the king was as much part of the religion. Religion wasn't a separate thing. Government and religion was all combined in the ancient world. So these Hebrew prophets could speak for Yahweh to what is essentially the government. But the government was really, you see what I mean? It's all mixed together. Now we have these separate categories. Religion is a separate, privatized sphere. Government is totally separate, which is a good thing. That's a modern nation state, separation of religion and government. So how could someone actually have any force that's speaking for God to our elected officials? I don't know. It gets kind of mixed up now. In fact, too confusing even to think about. But I guess what I want to land on is if there's no category for a Hebrew prophet today, somehow you have to channel that figure. We all have to become the Hebrew prophet somehow. And these are the two essential things I think about. If you want to be a Hebrew prophet, or if you want to be prophetic, in some basic way, you have to be on the side of the underdog. That just seems, by definition, what they're animated by. Have you found ways in your life to be on the side of the underdog? Or do we kind of coddle up to those in power, or now we're so worried about ourselves? It's be on the side of the underdog, but then also find some way in your life to speak truth to power. Have you ever heard of Bayard Rustin? Have you ever heard of Bayard Rustin? We think that phrase, speaking truth to power, came from him. He was a gay black man born around the 1900s, early 1900s, and grew up Quaker. But he's sort of the precursor to the civil rights movement. He organized the March on Washington. He's kind of the person that was organizing much of Martin Luther King's work. In fact, Martin Luther King learned about nonviolence from Bayard Rustin. And it was Bayard Rustin that talked about how speaking truth to power is, well, that's what it's in essence to be spiritual, to seek justice. Have you found any way to speak truth to power? That's not just posting on Facebook. I mean, And I don't know how I'm worried about this because I don't know exactly how we pull off being a prophet, but I know you have something to say about that challenge.
Well, always constantly thinking about prophets and prophetic life. After all, part of my work here is to practice justice. So I'm constantly and I grew up in a tradition where my father was a local church pastor, and he would preach from these prophets and invite the community to be engaged with their neighbors. And so sometimes folks ask me, what are the roots of this way of being in you? Well, they kind of go deep within my own kind of a theological and spiritual autobiography. What captivates me about Amos, he is uber angry, yes, partially because these ancient folks also understood something else, which was that they believed that there was this covenant that the people had made with God.
That's right. And even the king had.
And the king had. So the king was chosen by God to lead the people into that covenant keeping. So Amos is upset because you broke a promise. I can almost hear the kids saying that, right? Dad, you broke a promise. God put you in charge so that you would lead us in the way of the promises that we made together. So you broke the promise.
You're not doing what you said you would do.
You are not doing what you said you would do. So that righteous indignation is rooted in the sense that they had this covenant keeping. God always keeps a covenant, and we keep on breaking the covenant. And so there's that. The other thing that I think about often is that justice in this ancient tradition was not just doing the right thing, but was doing the thing that we believe God would do in the midst of us. So in some ways, the king was supposed to exercise God's way in the world, which is another reason why we have to be careful about connecting us today to prophets, because that's just, again, a category mistake, right? We don't have that kind of understanding of humanity, thank God, because I don't want to be God's mouthpiece.
Theocratic.
No, I don't want any of that. So then all of a sudden, they were in this circumstance where the basic part of the covenant was caring for one another. The basic part of this justice, of this doing what God does, is that those who were on the margins, those who had the least, those who needed the most care, were supposed to be the ones that were most cared for. And yet the king, as the ambassador of Yahweh, was not doing the thing that they should have been doing. The basic principle of leadership, right, was not being done. And so if we're to be prophets together, and I agree with you, Jim, that I think there's, instead of thinking about pastors as prophets, which is in itself dangerous, by the way, I love the idea that maybe it is us together. The prophetic lives among us, this prophetic vision. And what is that prophetic vision? To do what God does in the world.
And you spoke to me about how if we're going to work towards that, it's going to be a long task, and are we up to that? Could you describe?
That's the beauty of the text, that you go from the anger to then he says, out of frustration, so let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Now, you know, Jim, that I don't like that word righteousness very much. It's got this kind of sense
in English, it sounds judgy. And
judgy and like I'm better
connotation.
than you type of thing. But in this ancient text, the word's the same. Let that which is just roll down like waters, and justice like a never-flowing stream. Sometimes we, in our effort, we see that something in the world's not right. And at the core of prophetic witness is a sense that something in the world's not right. We see the suffering. We see the despair. We see the violence. We see how the world's not fair. So we see that. We see it on our televisions. We see it on our phones. We might walk around. I walk around this neighborhood and I see it with my own eyes, and it breaks my heart. And sometimes anger comes from within me too. Even now, I'm sure you do too. You see things, and I want to do like Amos. I want to say, to hell with all of this, right? I want to shake people in power and say, you have broken the people's trust. But I'm so glad that Amos, even in his own anger and despair, lands on something that I needed to hear, which is, let that which is right or just roll down like waters. Think about what water does over time.
Slow work.
Slow work. But if you just let water trickle on a piece of concrete or a rock, over time,
You get Grand Canyon.
you get the Grand Canyon. So let that which is right roll down like waters. And let justice, like an ever-flowing stream. The image I used with you earlier this week was, often we think of justice as a geyser. This explosion. And it's loud, and it gets attention, and it's angry. I'm afraid that maybe we can counter anger with anger, hopelessness with hopelessness. We cannot counter dehumanization with dehumanization. That's the opposite.
Yeah.
This call of Amos, it's a call for us to come together and live the kind of justice that's an ever-flowing stream, steady, always, together, flowing in a particular way, just allowing our witness, our love, our compassion, our attention. We talk about this often too, but in our own ministry, it's like, can I pay attention to neighbor? Can I humanize neighbor? Can I humanize my coworker? Can I humanize the person that stops me at the grocery store, or the person that needs gas, at the gas station? And to me, that's the ever-flowing stream over time, staying with it in a life, because water is life-giving, in a life-giving and loving way. It might seem like that's not enough, but in these days, I think the call of Amos is important for us. Not a geyser, an ever-flowing stream, together over time, the prophetic work among us.
So being a Hebrew prophet isn't just a burst of anger, but slow, steady work. And even that phrase, justice like an ever-flowing stream, the Hebrew prophets were poets. It's almost all in poetry. We can barely imagine how those categories go together. Could we let poetry... That almost sounds ridiculous, that social justice work could be an act of poetry.
Oh, but I think you're right. The arts, the music.
Yeah.
I think I recently was reading a book on reparations.
Yeah.
And part of the book was reminding us that maybe we should lift up the arts among marginalized communities, and writing and music.
It's you open the Bible, it's all poetry that they're speaking in. But it's not just that they're poets. If you're going to be prophetic, you have to be a bit of an oddball. And they were oddball characters. I mean, they were sort of these performance artists where, Jeremiah would break those containers as an act of defiance, or Isaiah would walk around nude for 3 years. Was it Jeremiah that laid on his side for...
No, I'm trying to remember.
I can't remember what prophet that was. But they did...
Or Ezekiel. Those visions of Ezekiel are whack.
Yeah, they were willing to be weird. At some point, we have to be willing to be a bit weird, huh?
I think First-Plymouth is a little weird, and I kind of like it. So my hope is that it's okay to get angry. We all get angry. It's okay that our hearts break. Can we come together and be energized and have a prophetic imagination, allowing our individual ways of being weird and quirky together to guide us towards a world, slowly but surely, that looks more like what God wants for the world.
Let's be justice that flows like an ever-flowing stream.
Thanks be to God.